Good morning from wherever you are around the globe. Today we are talking about the 7 steps to data conversion success. So we're really navigating the pre-implementation planning. If you've listened to these webinars before, it's coming from Panorama. Well, today we're going to slightly change it. Myself, Jeff McPherson, Director of Client Services at Panorama, on the right there. And on the left we have...
Hi, I'm Kate Miller. I am a principal with Premier International out of Chicago, and we specialize in data migration services.
Yeah, and Panorama and Premier International have been working in a partnership over the last year and a half. We sometimes work on projects together, and sometimes we stumble across each other on respective projects. So definitely we leverage each other's skill sets on projects. So so today is really walking through getting you organized for a data conversion for implementation. If you are attending this and you would like a 1-hour free consulting, Panorama does provide that for the first 3 respondents after today's webinar. So don't hit the button yet, but that is available. We'll provide the contact information at the end of this webinar. So to run through the contents of this, we'll introduction to Panorama, introduction to Premier International, and then we'll get into the meat of the webinar, which is really looking at that pre-implementation overview, project inputs, business and system tasks. So really looking at that people, process, technology aspect of data conversion. And then as we go through the webinar, please send in your questions, and we'll leave about 10-15 minutes at the end to answer. We won't be able to answer all of them, but some of those questions that come up. So to talk about Panorama, Panorama is an independent ERP consulting firm. And the service we're looking at is digital transformation and strategy. We also provide services around business process improvement, business management, organization change management, contract negotiations, project recovery. So a lot of it is really that people process aspect around these systems when you're trying to replace, upgrade the strategy around your business information systems. And then the verticals we're looking at, manufacturing, distribution, healthcare, professional services, government, retail, energy. We have 20 years of experience in consulting, with vendor experience. The team that we have at Panorama is, Six Sigma, MBAs, PMPs, and then there is, a team ready for global deployment. Now, our clients, just a few of our clients, they're from a lot of different industries, but from an information perspective, we see a lot of similarities, and we do learn between the different industries. And what was, as a team over the 15 years of Panorama's been around, being able to fine-tune the process of and understand the needs and demands around business information. As I said, we're independent, so we have no connections, contracts, anything with any of the ERP vendors or the VARs, the value-added reseller. So we're really looking for the connection of providing you the software package that meets your business needs and also culturally aligns with you.
At Premier International, we've been around since 1985, specializing specifically in data migrations. And I've personally spent the past 2 decades helping companies around the world take the pain out of their data migration process. Premier works across all of the major ERP platforms, as well as HCM systems, PLM, MRP, you name it. If it has data, we'll work with it. And we work across pretty much any industry vertical. One thing that we've seen be consistent across all our projects is that the proper planning and preparation can make the difference between success and failure. And that's true of any project, but it's no less true of the data migration piece. So throughout this webinar today, we'll be talking through how do you make sure that you are planning appropriately for the data component of your implementation.
Yeah, so the real piece of this is in this diagram we're looking at here. We're really looking at the business technology project lifecycle. So on the left-hand side, you can see the software selection. So many of you may be going through this now or thinking about going through it and picking your software. And there's a lot of, the kind of blue task there is really the business activities. The section we have highlighted in the middle is really what we're looking at, pre-implementation or planning around implementation. And the green pieces are the technical activities. That's when your vendor would normally come in and they would complete those tasks. And then we have the gray piece, which is a business technology aspect of it. And yes, you can see that the data strategy really it overlaps both the business side and the technology side of an organization. And you do see that strategy really needs to be upfront in that planning phase. And we do see a lot of times that it is left a little late. And we'll talk about some of the stories of where that happens and the reasons why it needs to happen up front. So it's really for your project managers out, this data strategy aspect needs to be up front.
Yep, absolutely, Jeff. Data considerations and realities will impact your design, your schedules, and your resourcing for the project. If you don't consider your data until later in the process, you may find that those assumptions and expectations are not wholly correct.
Absolutely. So when we're looking at pre-implementation goals, the way we're looking at it from a Panorama perspective is the people and processes. And what we're trying to do here is we need to educate the organization, the executive level, also the core team, and the wider organization. We're looking at ownership, and part of that is ownership of data, but it's also ownership of processes. And then we need alignment of everyone understanding what the scope is and what it is. Once you have that in the planning phase, then you can start addressing the technology of what that technology scope is. So we had a boot camp a couple of months ago, and one of the questions was, what are the key components of a pre-implementation? And there's a lot of them, but just break down to those four. There's obtaining executive and core team buy-in and ownership is essential. Clearly defined scope and timeline, sufficient committed resources, and detailed definition of data conversion strategy and scope. And so we're focusing on the data conversion aspect of your pre-implementation today.
Data fuels your business process. If your data is incorrect, very few other things matter. Your data drives reports that your executives are looking at to make key decisions. It drives how your business interacts day to day, and it drives the ability to be able to deliver for your customers. Oftentimes, data migration is not considered as part of the deliverables that your solution vendor or your system integrator will bring with them. They will put it on you to be able to get the data to the point that it can be loaded into the new system. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong with that. We recently had a project where much of the solution design was based on an assumption that all of the locations were using items in a particular way. That is, our client assumed that each individual item was treated consistently at all of their locations where that item existed. When we started looking into the data, we actually found that was not the case at all, to the surprise of leadership. They've been basing their new system solution design on how the process worked at one particular plant. And when they found out that each plant was using a different process, they had to quickly scramble to figure out how to get everyone aligned. That not only left them adjusting their design, but they also had to look at the impact on their schedule and their team structure. Whereas if they had done some of that due diligence up front, they could have avoided that and been able to work towards a plan that had taken those realities into place. Data migration is always more complicated and more complex than you think it will be. And if you're not doing the proper preparation, then you're going to end up in a scenario where you end up with results that are not what you expect.
Absolutely, and we see that time and time again on the respective projects that we work on. So, when it does go wrong, what is the impact of the project? What we see is if it's not ready and set up initially, you start seeing the issues pretty quickly in that design build phase. The budget and the schedule overrun happens, and trying to play catch up pretty much never works. The system doesn't work correctly. Customizations and interfaces are just not providing the data that's needed. And then the team is, they put a lot of effort into this, and that frustration starts to seep in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the perfect case study for all three of these areas, both the project impact, the business impact, and the personal impact, is the case of Target Canada. it's kind of become a bit notorious when you start talking about data migrations going wrong. Target Canada had a famously terrible implementation about 5 years ago, and one of the many causes of the failure was their data. A postmortem found that only about 30% of the data in the new system was actually accurate. And so the impact was widespread, starting with the project impact. The team working on the project was spending a lot of late hours trying to get the data correct and into their new system, and everybody was becoming frustrated. And during testing, they weren't able to do full testing because the data wasn't accurate. The business impact was visible right away. And the supply chain, once they went live, their supply chain essentially collapsed. Because the data was incorrect, they couldn't tell what they actually had versus what they didn't have, couldn't tell what stores needed stock, couldn't tell where things were actually at. And so this led to frustrated customers being faced with empty shelves when they went into Target to try to buy something. Eventually, Target was unable to right the ship, and they ended up pulling out of Canada. And so that's where you start getting into that personal impact. Not only was it a public relations disaster, but the personal impact on some of the people responsible for the project was immense. And for all of these reasons, a lot of which boils down to the underlying data, Target is no longer a presence in Canada.
Yeah, I think the piece here is really take the time to do this planning aspect of it, because once you get in a project, things happen very fast and there's a lot going on, and if you have the building blocks and the framework and structure in place, it's going to make your life a lot easier, especially from a PM perspective.
So oftentimes what we see when we're working with companies who are doing a data migration is the effect of kind of underestimating the complexity. They think that all they need to do is move the data from point A to point B and they're good to go. As you are hopefully aware, it's not quite that simple, or it is very rarely that simple. A client I worked with last year fell right into these traps. They were initially convinced that data migration was simply pushing data from A to B, even though they were moving to a completely new and much more complex platform than what they had been using in the past. By underestimating the effort to such a degree, they didn't even start working on their migrations until 3 weeks before their scheduled go live. And they didn't have a data hammer to force the data into the new system. So by the time they got to go live, they had very little data that was actually in their system, and they had to push their go live. That's where we came in. We walked the project leadership through everything we're about to walk through with you on this webinar and help them recalibrate for their remaining deployments. The number one thing that you can do is do that planning to make sure that you're not finding yourself in this scenario.
Yeah, I think the big piece here is also education of the executive team, because if your system's kind of clunky and everything's reported out of Excel, most of the data they get is provided to them. So they may not have a good insight into the landscape of the data and the systems that you have. And so they need to be aware of that. So, if they're making decisions of what the project is and the ease of what the data conversion will be, they're doing that based on the knowledge they have. So it's key to provide them the correct information.
Yeah, so what's your plan? Do you know how you're getting your data from point A to point B and all the points in between?
Yeah, I think, this is jumping into, we talked about the presentation, webinar here is the 7 steps to conversion success. So this is what we're going to run through today. The business strategy, the system and scope, and the gap analysis. That's the project input, so that's the people piece of the puzzle. And then we'll jump into more of the business and technical tasks, the process and the technology. We'll look at data strategy, data scope, conversion requirements, and communication. So we'll jump into that first piece, the project input. And so we really need to start at a high level and kind of drill down, and we're trying to get a framework for this that's in scope. And from a project management perspective, we have documentation that we can put into a project charter, and then that fades into the communication plan. So the project input we need is, what is the business strategy? What is the IT strategy? And then we know not all organizations have those clearly laid out. But the next piece that really need to be addressed is, what are the entities we're looking at, locations? What is that structure between entities? What is that structure between facilities? Understanding that information flow. Need to know the organization structure, and we need to know what that project organization structure is. and defining the goals and objectives. So it's really what do we define as success for a project? When we have clarity around that, then you can move forward. We're working with an organization right now, and they're going through that process. And we laid out what they need to do for pre-implementation. They thought it was a little too long, but now we're going through the process. Like, we have a lot of things we need to discuss in-house and get things aligned in-house before we can really start to look at technology. So they see the benefit of it, and they're going through that, and it just takes time, and organizations need to do that.
Right, and although there may not be a technical deliverable here at this phase, the data side of the house does certainly influence, or should certainly influence, all of these things that you're thinking through in terms of your business strategy. The decisions that you're making about your entities, your locations, what it's going to look like going forward, if you're doing any consolidation or restructuring, that's all going to have an impact on what needs to happen to your data during the process. And if you're not thinking about that, you may not be correctly resourcing or budgeting for the effort that has to happen on the technical side of the house. Just as a quick real-world example, we were working with a company a few months ago that had been burned a little bit by past implementations. And they shared a story with us from an earlier project they had done internally. And during that project, they were closing and consolidating several of their locations. And so as part of that, they had to make sure that nothing went missing as part of those closures. Everything from the closed locations had to make it their way to the remaining locations so that the customer experience was seamless. And a few weeks after they flipped the switch on that process, they started getting calls from angry customers asking where their shipments had gone. Turns out that during that consolidation, they didn't capture all of the outstanding sales orders because they hadn't thought through how the consolidation was going to work, and some of the locations were missed. And so those orders were essentially abandoned, and the customer felt the brunt of it.
So now you understand the overarching piece of the strategy and what we're looking at. And so now the next piece is dropping that next level down and looking at the systems and the modules. With implementations, you can't implement everything you want to implement. You really need to get that base foundation put in. So we can talk about a current digital footprint. So what are we talking about there is really like, what are all your different business systems and how do they interface today? And then the next piece is taking that and it's like, okay, what is a phase one map of what's practical? Because not all your business systems are going to go away. Not all the interfaces, all the ones that you want will happen in that first phase. So really agreeing what that is and that scope, and that's talking about time and the cadence of the organization. And really seeing what that change is. Are we talking about 2 interfaces? Are we talking about 3 interfaces? Is there new data that needs to be created? And then it's really looking at, if there's any customizations that need to come in. We want to start talking about data owners, who owns the data. Most organizations we walk into, it's kind of a group hug kind of, everyone owns the data, but no one owns the data. And then that's where you get that frustration of data not being accurate. Looking at what resources we need on the project, timelines, and then any regulatory compliance that we need to have when you're looking at data.
Right, and all of those decisions in terms of what the project looks like has a definite downstream impact on the data migration. One of the key things to consider here is not only what does your future footprint look like, but how do the pieces of your future footprint interact with each other. And as part of the testing and the validation of your new system, specifically the data migration piece, you need to make sure that you're taking those relationships into account, so that the data that's making it into your new system is getting correctly pushed to all of the interfaces, and that your plan takes into account that type of testing. If you have a PLM system and an ERP system, so say you're doing your engineering in one system and your fulfillment in another, you need to make sure that those teams are being aligned. We have a project right now where the client is doing both a PLM and an ERP deployment. They're not doing them at the same time. They have their schedule offset a little bit. And so the PLM side went live first, so the engineering side went live first. Well, obviously the engineering side does have an eventual impact on the ERP side. Unfortunately, that client had not involved the ERP side in the testing of their PLM solution, which meant by the time the data flushed down to what the ERP team was using, it didn't necessarily have all of the components that the ERP side needed to be able to affect their implementation. And so this actually led to a scramble after the PLM side was already live to push some additional data into that production system to support the next piece that was coming on. So you should be thinking through all of these different relationships and dependencies and make sure that as part of your planning, you understand what different teams need to be involved in each of the different areas and make sure that they're not being siloed based on just a very narrow view of what your future footprint looks like.
Yeah, and you got to look from a technical resource perspective. If you're using a company like Premier International, or you're doing it in-house, is really that team really needs the clarity of what is happening and where it's happening. A lot of those resources will have a lot of insight and input, and you want them as a PM to be feel like they have a voice. They're in part of the conversation, and so that's really key as you go through this. That they're really involved in this planning process, and sometimes they're not. And they'll execute what you give them, but you may have not thought through everything, and they will challenge you of how you're looking at this data and what this data is, and so it's definitely a key factor. So when we're looking at data strategy, it really comes down to what data do you need on day one to run your business. You know, a lot of organizations we walk into, they're like, oh, we want the last 5 years worth of data. That's going to change your timeline just based on that answer. So it's like, what is really practical? Is it, just open POs? Is it open AR? Can I, for shop orders, can I, produce more in my old system and have very few open? Those are the things. The more you can minimize this, the better. You want to look at what that scope is by phase. Maybe not all the data, some of that historical data comes on later, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide around the data warehouse strategy. What is that data conversion strategy? What is cleansing? Who's doing what? And then back again, that piece, which is the pillar in this, is define the master data owners. And it's also, looking at those transactional data owners as well.
Right. And as you're going through that, as you're planning your project, this should be just another part of planning your project, making sure that you know what your strategy is for all of the data impact. So your data strategy should include not just your data warehousing strategy and your data conversion strategy, but it should also encompass what is your strategy for getting your data cleansed prior to going into the new system. If you have multiple sources of truth today, what is your plan to combine them? What is your harmonization strategy? If you have gaps between what you have today and what the new system will require, or what your new business process will require, what is your data enrichment strategy to fill those gaps? And then finally, if there is a difference in structure between how your data is maintained and managed today and what will be required in your new solution, what is that structuring strategy? If you can take the time during pre-implementation to define how each of these activities is going to be completed, when you get into the execution phase of your project, all you should have to do is execute against your plan. It's a lot easier to do that than try to define both your strategy and execute against it both at the same time. And finally, the final note here, as you're putting together those strategies, you should also be resourcing your strategy and defining who is going to be responsible for each of these activities. And if that's taking them away from their day-to-day activities that they are currently tasked with, what is the plan to backfill those responsibilities so that they can dedicate the time and efforts that may be necessary to these project-related tasks?
Yeah, that's a great point, Kate. Because when you start talking about resources that can do this data cleansing, it's really those. It's not something you can hire to do because they have tribal knowledge. And a lot of times that's your key people that you have that run your business. So be able to give them time and put them in a role that they can be successful, and being realistic what it is. And when we're talking about, some of this data is just putting the structure around. It's like, how are we going to standardize how we spell street? How do we do saint? I mean, just things like that. Those type of rules need to be in place. And so when we're looking at a data warehouse, I try to walk through this to explain what it is, because we talked about data being what you need on phase one. So on the left-hand side here, let's say you've got system A, so that could be whatever it is, Sage 500, or Mass 500 system. Is that you got your master data, You've got your historical data you need for phase one. You've got your historical data that is not required for phase one. And typical data you don't need for phase one would be, I need to have a closed PO from 3 years ago. Will you get a call on that? It's possible, and that does happen, right? Especially in that first 3 to 6 months after you go live. But let's just keep that in mind as we go through this. So we will look to phase one. We look to convert that master data and the historical data for day one. And what happens in this current system is it switches to read only. So it doesn't go away, because we still need to answer that question that calls up. It's like, oh, we had a discrepancy with a PO and an AP invoice from 3 years ago. Can you give us the answer? So obviously you need that. So it doesn't go away. So then we start. So now we have the data. We're going live. We have what we need. But we still need to get off this old system, because we're still paying maintenance fees on that and support. So what we want to do is to take that historical data and move it over to our historical data server, into a structure that makes sense for your organization. It really becomes a second project. It's like a phase two data conversion project. And what it does, if you try and do that all at once, the scope of your data conversion for your phase one go live is just too large. At the same time, when you're doing that post go live data conversion, you're going to convert your new system data and historical data into the data warehouse. So data warehouse, if you think it's kind of an umbrella of multiple systems, and now that historical data is going to feed into that data warehouse as well. So you can get that full picture. So when you have that VP of sales, like, I want to see my sales history over 3 years or 5 years, this is the data warehouse tool that you want to go into. And data warehouses are designed, ERP systems are really good at processing transactions. Their data structure is not ideal for reporting. A data warehouse structure allows you to have that reporting tool, and the structure is a lot more user-friendly. And that's really where you want those dashboards to come from, and where you want the executives to be drilling in and getting those dashboards and data. So that's what we recommend of this. It makes your implementation easier, and it allows you to focus on what is really important for day one. So you've got to start thinking about this in planning of what that strategy will be as you go live. And it's a really good place if you guys start, as you're an organization, you start buying other companies, you can roll them up into this data warehouse really quickly, even if they're on another system. So it gives you flexibility and be able to have real-time data pretty quickly from a newly acquired company.
Right. For the data that you can't put into your warehouse, the data that you need to get into your new system, whether it's master data or open transactional data, or however much history you decide is going into your new system, that's where you need to define your data conversion strategy of how you're getting it from where it is today to where you need it tomorrow. If you've ever thought of data conversion as a ETL or extract, transform, load process, you can kind of think of the 3 lines on this garden hose here as extract for the first line, transform for the middle line, and load for the bottom line. But if we think about it in a different way, we can also look at that first line as pre-implementation planning, the middle line as the execution during your project, and the bottom line as the load component or the post-live component. So if we look at the first line, you can see there's a lot of different activities there, and the amount of activities just continue throughout the process. When extracting data from your legacy systems, you need to understand not only where is your data at today, but also what are all of the different systems, what are all of the different sources, where is their overlap, what aspect of it is relevant to your go-forward solution, because that's going to help you scope your conversion activity. And by having that information during planning, you can make sure that you're resourcing and planning properly. And when we say planning, it's not just planning the development of the conversion process or developing the execution of the conversion process. It's also planning for your overall project schedule. When you start laying in where your go live is going to be, where your test cycles are going to be, if you've not allocated enough time to complete the data conversion components of the project, you may find yourself going into a test cycle without actually having any converted data because there wasn't enough time to accurately build those processes. So during the pre-implementation, you should be getting that idea of what exists today and doing a data assessment so that you can understand not only what is in our systems, but where are those gaps? Where do we have duplication? Where do we need to develop some of these strategies that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so what we've talked about at this point is we've talked about business strategy, system and module scope, and gap analysis. And now we're going to jump in kind of that next level of detail around the process and the technology. So you have the vision of what you want, and you've got your arms around the framework. You start looking at data strategy, data scope, conversion requirements, and communication. So first up on data scope, we've talked about what modules are being replaced and what the digital footprint looks like. Now we've really got to create a map that looks like where is the data. We had an organization that had the customer master in 7 locations. And so for that is like, okay, which is the single source of truth? Which is the starting one that we're like, it's 80% of what we need or 70%? And then how do we feed in the rest of that data so we have one source of what the customer master needs to be? You know, a piece of starting with this is knowing where your data is. That's great. The next piece of that is what do the executives want and what are the functional needs from a KPI and reporting perspective. Now, don't just take it like what they have today, because they may only have today what they have today because that's what the system allows them. But really, you know, with those executives, take the time, you know, sit down with them and really pull out what data they'd like ideally. And most executives can do that in an hour and a half, because they're frustrated and they know what they need to, what they need, and look at how often they need it in real time, weekly, and so forth. And that really drives the core team to think about when they set up and design the system, does the data need to be part of a master file? Do we need to change our process so that data is captured? So it gives them a vision of where they need to go to. So when you do go live, the executives are getting exactly what they want, and the functional leads are getting what they want. And then also, you know, so when you're talking about future data requirements, maybe the data doesn't exist. So you may have to create some data. We have seen some organizations where they had bill of materials, but they didn't have all of them, so they had to actually create some bill of materials and go through that process. Once again, any legal requirements around historical data, and then the scope of transactional data is key. You don't want to get bogged down. If you try and bring across too much data historically, say it's over 5 years, you may have done processes 3 different ways. So your one conversion of, say, inventory transaction now just turned into 3 data conversions for inventory transactions because the processes were different or the data was changed, like customer type, customer class. So there are the things you need to think about when you're on the scope aspect of it.
Right. And so once you start discussing and defining your data scope, you start to have deliverables falling onto the technical side of things. When it comes to data conversion is a business-driven process. Your business or functional people, depending on how you refer to them, should be driving the data conversion. The technical side will help execute it, but they should not be making the decisions about what happens with the data. When the technical team tries to define the conversion requirements, you end up with cases where they have not interpreted correctly how the business is actually using the system. So during this phase, during the scoping phase, you're getting access to all of the data and starting to work with the business and communicate with the business to understand what the data is actually telling you. So that helps you to perform that harmonization review, come up with your conversion strategy, and define your cleansing strategy. We had a client a few years back that had the technical team actually defining their conversion process and defining their conversion requirements. And because the technical team didn't realize that the US and European entities of this company were using processes completely differently, were using the system completely differently, had customized the system to do different things for the different locations, they had built a process based entirely on what the US was doing, ignoring what Europe was doing. Europe was actually deploying first. And so the first test cycles they did, they ran into a lot of problems because the business took one look at the data and said, this is completely useless. We refuse to continue testing because this doesn't reflect our reality or our process. So because the business was not driving the process, because they had not done this background discussion and this background review to make sure that they were going to have a process that fit all of their locations, they lost an entire test cycle and ended up having to reschedule this activity, which was involving dozens and dozens of people across their European entities, until they could get those issues resolved, the process aligned. And in the end, they ended up losing 3 months from their schedule because of this. Whereas if they had done that proper planning up front, they could have stayed on schedule and had a European test team that was much happier with the experience, rather than the first taste of the new system that they were seeing leaving a bitter taste in their mouth.
Yeah, I mean, Kate's bringing up some great examples today, and you know, if you look at them, these companies are losing 3 to 4 months in their timeline, even longer, and the cost of doing that, I mean, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. So this planning piece is so key up front, and spending more money up in the structure is absolutely key. So then we drop into, you know, what is the gap analysis of this? You know, we define new processes that need to be thought through. We touched on new data, but there are other pieces. Just the main framework of hierarchy. Some, you know, with product and customer hierarchy is definitely one that comes up. Some organizations that become a quick conversation. Sometimes it can be dragged out for months, and it's really trying to get that alignment between accounting, operations, and sales of what that is. And you're talking about reporting structure and rolling that up. The manual data cleansing process we want to do the least as possible, but some of it is just you can't program around it. But just doing that, and then harmonization rules. And then Kate, you know, on your side to get the technical task there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Depending on the state that your data is in today, and depending on whether or not you've maintained your data or enforced standards around the data in your existing landscape, you may be faced with a very easy cleansing process, or you may be faced with a very daunting cleansing process. If you've never maintained your data within your organization, the amount of effort required is going to be much more than those organizations which do have a very well-defined data management process and policy. So again, by starting it early and understanding the shape that your data is actually in, rather than the shape that you think your data is in, you can take a look at not only what are our gaps that we have to fill, but also what do we need to fix because it's going to break the new system in terms of our data content. What do we need to do to make sure that the amount of configuration that we have to do is as minimal as possible, because we've taken care of the 15 different codes that all mean the same thing, which not only will reduce the configuration effort, but will also make some of your KPIs and executive reports that much more useful, because you no longer have spend, for instance, being split across 5 different groups that mean the same thing. You consolidate them, you can get a much better idea of your spend or your sales from an executive perspective. So by starting the process early, you make sure that there's enough runway to accomplish these tasks. It's very common that when data cleansing isn't thought of until late in the process, that there's just not enough time to get it done. And so you cut corners, or you make the decision that we'll fix it later. And later never happens. If you put garbage into your new system, you're going to get garbage out. And when you're going into a new system that you've spent a lot of time and effort getting into, the last thing that you want is to continue dealing with the problems that you're working around today because your data doesn't support what your business actually requires.
Yeah, and then from a PM perspective, you're always playing catch up, and you can't throw more resources and do that catch up aspect of it. And as a PM, now you're managing a data conversion and all the issues with that, and you're not managing what you need to be focusing on, is that how the new system is to be used, what are the policies and procedures, and the improvements that you're looking to get out of the system. You're kind of bogged down in, because of the lack of planning, you're bogged down in a project that shouldn't have occurred. Kate and I have seen projects where it's done really well and done poorly. And if it's done well, from a consulting perspective, we can be sitting around after you go live for 2 weeks doing nothing, which is great, right? And that's really what the goal is.
Yeah, I'm still, like, my entire career, I've spent chasing one perfect go live I had, where we were sitting on a boat in the middle of the ocean, hitting the button to go live because everything had been taken care of beforehand, and the cutover and the go live was a non-event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so now we're looking at data conversion requirements. That data conversion migration requirements. We want to look at field and file data mapping, and this is kind of the piece of where it is that detailed aspect, right? You know, we're not going to lie, data conversions are a bit of a grind, and it's kind of like rowing the boat across the Atlantic. But this is the detailed level that will, if you're patient and take the time, can definitely save you tenfold the amount of time going forward. And any of those customer frustrations that Kate's touched on. You know, we're going to look at what are we reconciling, because we have the data owners. You know, what are the reconciling reports that we all agreed on? You need to have your auditors. You know, we'll talk about communication, but they need to be involved in this and understanding that. You know, what is the nomenclature? You know, what are the templates? The software vendors will give you different templates to load the data, and working with them of how that works and what their templates are. They're not going to be interested about what happened before, or their contracts are going to say, you will cleanse the data and populate these templates. They'll show you how to populate the data, but they don't want to get involved in the data cleansing process because it's too much of a wild card, and that's not what they specialize in. That's where the Premier Internationals of the world kind of come and help you out there. And then I was also looking at the data migration sign-off processes. What are we agreeing to when? And we have that stage gates as you go through the stage gates of the project.
Right. So the conversion requirements, that's often where companies start thinking about their conversion. But as we've been talking through this entire webinar, you can see there's a lot of steps that inform your requirements and that kind of lead into these activities. So can you do a data conversion just looking at what's written on this slide and ignoring everything else we've talked about so far? Sure you can. Is it going to be as successful as if you're going through the proper planning and making sure that you have the information to inform these activities? No, it probably won't be. By following these steps, you kind of get yourself in a place that when you're putting together those conversion requirements, you're not guessing, you're not having to try to figure it out. You already know what exists, how the processes work today, and how that's going to go into what needs to happen tomorrow. So as you start defining these requirements, they're coming from a place of deep understanding rather than a place of expectations and assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, everything we're talking about are business conversations. We're not getting down to, you know, prior to this slide, it's all around the business and scope and the strategy of what we're trying to do. We're not even talking about pulling data across yet. So, you know, as we go through this is the majority of what you need to be doing is this pre-implementation aspect. Yeah, and I agree with Kate. A lot of companies come in here, it's like, okay, let's start mapping. And it's like, you're starting at the wrong point. And so, you know, it's the same thing when you build a house, right? You don't just start building a house. There's a whole bunch of planning that happens, and, you know. So it's the same thought process, and it really is to take the time to do that. So the big key piece here is around what is a communication plan. And Kate, there are so many groups, you know, especially from a technical aspect that need to be communicated in this step.
Yeah, it is absolutely essential that your teams not be siloed, whether that's your different aspects of your functional team or your functional team and your technical team or your data team. All your teams need to be integrated and need to be communicating. One of our current clients was using their internal team to implement their first divisions into a new ERP solution. We came in on a later wave. But when they were doing the project internally, they were siloing their teams to specific functions, and those teams didn't necessarily communicate with each other. So the impact of this was, if we take a data conversion example, one team was responsible for loading the customers to their new system, which they did. The customers were loaded pretty successfully. I think they got 90% of their customers in, so they were happy to hand it off to the sales order team to start testing the load of the sales orders. The sales order team went through their process, loaded their sales orders, or I should say attempted to load their sales orders. Very few of their sales orders actually loaded into the new system. And when they started digging into it, it took them a couple of days, but they eventually got to the root cause. Apparently, the customers that were loaded were not the same as the customers which were reflected on their sales orders. Because the teams hadn't talked to each other and understood the requirements that they had that impacted one another, the customer team had said, this is the group of customers we're taking forward. The sales order team had said, these are our open sales orders. This is what needs to go forward. And the overlap of the two was not as complete as it should have been. If they had talked beforehand and if they had coordinated their processes, they would have avoided not only the week that it took them to figure out what was going wrong, but then also the extra time that it took to reload a subset of customers, to reload all of the sales orders rather, and essentially have to do everything twice instead of do it once. That's just one small example, but any of these projects has hundreds of examples like that, even just within the realm of data conversion. So making sure that you have planned for that and that you have those open communication channels and are making sure that your teams are talking with one another and that they have a framework to do so is another critical aspect of getting your conversion correct.
Absolutely. So when we jump into this slide here, it's really like, okay, it's really a communication and plan around this. Obviously, we have the project org structure and governance, which gives you that communication plan. So we've got to start thinking about who do we need to communicate with. The steering committee of the executives, definitely give them insight of what they're doing so they understand the scope. The data owners, what their responsibilities are. If you have different teams around e-commerce, the auditors, absolutely. So because they'll come in and audit the data conversion themselves, so they need to know what they're working with. And they may add some aspects from a compliance perspective. If you have EDI teams, payroll, absolutely, and the banks. And what are we looking to communicate? We're looking at what business decisions that happen, data definitions, the timing, what's going to be used in reconciliations. And don't just make this a one-time thing. It needs to be constant. You're going to have conference room pilots where there's going to be feedback. There'll be some adjustments. And so it's if the framework's in place and the communication in place, there's going to be issues. We're not saying it's going to be perfect, but you have a process to deal with it, and it's dealt with quickly. And the fundamental, what Kate's talking about in the examples, is fundamental underlying issues that you see in data conversions have been addressed. And that's the key piece. There's 3 or 4 key items normally came up in these data conversions. If that's thought through and addressed up front, then the other piece is just that tedious, painful process of going through a data conversion. So.
Right, and if you have empowered your technical team and your data conversion team to be involved in all of these discussions and to be kept informed, they can actually help you identify some of those cross-functional impacts that maybe you haven't thought through, or where there might be gaps or exceptions based on what they're seeing within the data. If the teams aren't talking, or the tech team doesn't feel like they have the authority to question things, then you can miss some of those, and they don't come up until they start causing problems in the final system.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, there's a number of implementations I've been to, and you just have a frustrated technical team is like, I'm not involved, I'm not being communicated, I'm doing what they're telling me to do, but I know there's bigger issues, but they don't have that voice, so it's critical. So let's just recap that, the people process of what we've walked through, the business strategy, system and module scope, gap analysis, get that lined in, data strategy, data scope, conversion requirements, communication. If you do this well, you're going to be like 90% ahead of most clients that we come across. And I think it is also the piece of put this in the charter, have it documented, because as a PM, you need to go reference a document. And so that is key. And so, let's go back to what we're trying to achieve in this, and that's really that pre-implementation goals, right? People, process, education, ownership, alignment. And with data, it's key. Education up and down the organization, ownership, data, transaction, master data, and then alignment. Everyone knows what's happening. We know what the customer type used to be X, now it used to be A, now it's going to be, in the new system, it's going to be called customer class, and now it's A and B, and it got broken out by X rule. So that really is key in the communication piece of this. All right. And then, the technology is absolutely the piece that makes it all work, right? But it's that business logic and thought process needs to happen up front.
Yeah, Jeff, I think you could almost think of these 3 pillars of people, process, and technology almost as a triangle. They're all informing each other, and they're all impacting each other. It's not that the people define the technology, but the technology can also inform back on the tasks under the people side of things. So keeping them all, or thinking of them all as 3 different prongs of one overall process, will help you make sure that you're planning appropriately.
Absolutely. A lot of times when we walk into these, these business system implementations, is people think it's a technology project, and it's not. Technology is a big part of it, but it's that people and processes. You're trying to align an organization and organization culture to a new system. All right, so just a reminder that there's a free hour of consulting from Panorama. If you want to reach us, you can contact us at panorama-consulting.com for a free hour of consulting. So if you're just starting this, you need some ideas, you feel like you're a bit of a silo because maybe your executives aren't listening to you, reach out to us and we'll see we can help you out and provide the insight that you're looking for. So Kate, I think we have a little bit of time left for questions. I appreciate those that sent the questions in. And let's take the first one. And Kate, I think the first one piece there is, when should you start a data conversion? For me, it's like the sooner the better. And most organizations I walk into, it's like, well, you should have done this yesterday. I don't know your
absolutely.
thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Data activities should really start when the rest of the project starts. They can even start before in some cases. Understanding the data content that you have today, how you're using it, how your current processes work, all of that information will influence the other conversations and decisions that are happening during the pre-implementation phase of your project. And one of the things that we see consistently across every company that I've ever worked with is that their current processes, their current data structures, their current data standards either don't exist, or if they exist, are not documented anywhere. So trying to understand that and get to the bottom of how things work can take some time. It can involve a lot of conversations. Getting on top of that early in your process can only help you over the course of your project.
Yeah, I think that, Kate, the conversations we've had over the recent months is when you talk about a data conversion, it's a one-time thing, and a lot of organizations have internal resources that can do it. They have the skill set up to do it, but they're kind of learning it a little bit from scratch because it's a one-time process for them. They do it every, 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. So it's not something that they do every day. And I think that sometimes executives forget about that. It's doable, but you got to still think through it all.
Yeah, oftentimes, unless you change organizations a lot, a major implementation or a major data conversion can be a once in a career or a twice in a career activity for a lot of people. On the data side, the technical portion is a place where you absolutely can and should be considering some external help. While your internal IT team can execute a conversion process, it is a different beast from anything that they do day to day. It's not an integration. It's not an interface. Data conversion has its own unique demands and requirements. External technical resources that have that data conversion experience can help you accelerate your process and ensure that nothing is being missed. And additionally, that's also going to free up your internal IT team to focus on those go-forward processes and requirements. The data migration is a one-time process, or maybe a couple of time process if you're doing a multiple stage deployments. But once you're up in the new system, your data conversion process basically gets thrown away. If your IT team can focus on things like interfaces, customizations, et cetera, things that are going to continue to add value day by day once you're in the new system, that's probably a better use of their time and effort.
Okay, let's go through a few more questions here. What's the best way to educate the executive team? And I know from my perspective, it's keeping it simple but providing the details. We talked about those digital footprints. That's the best way because it's on one slide, they can see it. We've been organizations, and the VP of IT provided us a digital footprint, and they had, I think, 15, 20 systems on there, and they were kind of joined. We went through with the core team, and after that, we had 37. So it is, and then when you show that to executives, they're not aware of all these different packages that people have got because there's a lot of packages they get online, and they're just trying to do their job, and they have a limited core system. They get creative. So that diagram we see is a really great communication tool, not just up the organization, but also down to the production workers of this is why we're doing the project.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. Understanding the complexity and communicating that complexity is the number one thing that you can do to kind of educate executives on why this process might need to start earlier than later and why it is so complicated. To take an example from a project I had 2 or 3 years ago, talking with the executives, they thought that their footprint was pretty straightforward. They were running one ERP system, they had a CRM connected to it, and that was it. They didn't realize that the business analysts all had their own version of the system. Every single business analyst had their own custom access database that they were using to do their job. None of them were the same. They were all completely person specific. And if we hadn't had those conversations, then we wouldn't have known that those existed. And once we started putting those onto the diagram and started talking to the executives about that, you could just see their eyes kind of open wide once they realized what was actually happening in the day-to-day. Normally they don't need to know the fact that there's all these different systems out there. What they care about is that the reports are accurate, that the KPIs are accurate, that the business is running smoothly, customers are getting shipped products, and there's no problems. But once you start digging below the surface and seeing all of what's actually going on down there, they can very quickly start to appreciate why a project might require this level of planning.
Okay. All right, Kate, I think we've got time for one last question. I think this is a good one. It kind of touches on what we were talking about a little bit before is, it's a one-time an event for a lot of people and organizations. Is what's the best mix of internal versus external resources?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. On the business side, you really need to have your internal people. The business is going to drive this process, or should be driving this process, the data migration process. The execution of a data migration is really just the fulfillment of the business's vision. What you're doing on the technical side is based on what they need to do their job. So a lot of that is, as you've mentioned, Jeff, a little bit earlier, it's tribal knowledge, things that if you bring somebody in from outside, they're not going to know necessarily how your business runs. So on that side of things, you definitely want to have your internal resources. For the external resources, the technical portion, so the execution of the data migration, is a place where that makes sense, as we've talked about, because it is the one-time thing, because there are unique challenges and demands of the process. Bringing in people that have that expertise can help you make sure that you're not overlooking things. You can benefit from issues that other companies have run into, because anybody you bring in externally is going to have their own experiences of what has caused other companies problems, and help you make sure that you don't make those same mistakes or run into those same issues. So there is a little bit of both. I think if I were looking at it, that's how I would look at it. From the business side, you want your internal people, and not people that you bring in just for the project, because they're not going to know the nuance. On the technical side, that's where you can start to benefit from those external resources.
Absolutely. So yeah, as we put this webinar together, we really talked about pre-implementation, and as we go forward, our plan is to have another 2 webinars really looking at this. We're looking at the implementation aspect of this, and then post go live of what, how do you continue to manage data and ensure you keep accurate data after all this great work you've done through the implementation. So at the moment, the goal is to push that in January. So between now and then, you can start going through the pre-implementation, start doing the education aspect of it. If you want to contact the respective organizations, Panorama or Premier, the information's up there on the screen. Laura Florence is the Director of Business Development at Panorama. Reach out to her. And then, as you've been listening, Kate Miller, obviously you've been talking today, Principal at Premier International, you can reach out and contact her. If we're here, if you have some questions, just kind of want to know where to go, definitely reach out. We appreciate your time and listening, and we hope you have an excellent rest of the day. And Kate, I greatly appreciate your time today.
Yep, thanks for helping us share the information, Jeff, and thanks everyone who has joined and listened to this presentation. If you have any questions, please do reach out.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.